Today, I'm going to talk about why the US empire is so desperate to prevent the creation of a multipolar world and why multipolarity is necessary for socialism. And I say this for a few reasons. One, there have been some socialist critiques of the idea of multipolarity, and I think they've been made in good faith, and I want to respond to them. The argument has been made that in the lead up to World War I, the world was a multipolar world. So the argument is, well, multipolarity and imperialism can still exist. And that's not wrong, but I think the situation today is extremely different. And there are a few fundamental reasons for that. One, multipolarity with a socialist pole within that multipolar system is fundamentally different from the multipolarity of the world leading up to World War I, which was a multipolarity of different colonialist powers. So it was not a genuine multipolarity in which there were countries of the global south that had independence and sovereignty. It was a multipolarity in which the European colonial powers had carved up the world, and there was an inter-imperialist rivalry between them. The situation has been very different since the first socialist revolution in Russia, and especially since the socialist revolution in Cuba, and especially in China as well. Those three revolutions have fundamentally changed the character of imperialism. The Cuban Revolution in Latin America, bringing in a new wave of socialism across Latin America. The Chinese Revolution being, after the Russian Revolution, the first great socialist Marxist revolution, and in a formerly colonized country that is also the largest country on the planet. So I'm going to talk about the fundamental distinctions between those. But before that, I want to talk really briefly about why socialism cannot exist without multipolarity, especially in the situation today, the global economic and political situation. We need to look at what unipolarity has been and understand that neoliberalism, the phase of capitalism that we've been living in for roughly 30 years or 40 years, is simply the phase of capitalism of the dictatorship of US imperial hegemony. It's not a coincidence that neoliberalism arose at the moment of decline and eventually overthrow of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. Neoliberalism arose in the 1980s with the decline and crisis within the Soviet Union and the eventual overthrow. And in the 1990s, with the overthrow of the Eastern Bloc and the US-led capitalist bloc's victory in the first Cold War, we saw the triumph of neoliberalism in most countries around the world as an expression of the economic order of US imperialism, and specifically US unipolar hegemony, forcibly subordinating countries around the world. And it is nearly impossible to develop socialism in that situation of unipolar hegemony. We saw, of course, a few notable exceptions. Cuba did manage to survive through very difficult circumstances in the special period of the 1990s. The DPRK has survived despite the brutal blockade on it. And then, of course, China, the People's Republic of China, was able to survive despite the coup attempt at Tiananmen, the color revolution attempt, and despite many other attacks. So they did manage to survive, but surviving is one thing. Being able to thrive and develop the productive forces and develop your society and advance the cause of socialism is something completely different. And the situation has fundamentally changed since then. But in the 1990s, with Francis Fukuyama and these sophists claiming the so-called end of history, and bourgeois liberal democracy with a neoliberal economic model being the supposed end of history, that represented the peak of US unipolar hegemony. And in those conditions, it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to develop socialism. So we also need to look at the rise of socialism as being facilitated by a multipolar system. And if we go back to the first Cold War, we have to understand that the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China were absolutely indispensable in supporting national liberation movements around the global south. And this isn't in any way to discount and undermine the incredible importance of the national movements, the indigenous movements, the agency of people resisting imperialism and colonialism inside those countries. But let's keep in mind that in the case of the Indian subcontinent, people were resisting British colonialism for nearly 200 years. And there were many brave revolutionaries, Bhagat Singh and countless others, who sacrificed their lives. but they were ultimately unsuccessful in overthrowing the British Empire. Of course, in Algeria, there were many decades of revolutionaries who fought against the French Empire. But it wasn't until after World War II, the rise of the Soviet Union as a significant pull in what was essentially a bipolar system, but was not a unipolar system. It provided breathing room and material support, not just breathing room, but weapons, political support, diplomatic support, and economic support to national liberation struggles across Africa, in Angola, in Zimbabwe, and South Africa, in Latin America, in Cuba, and Nicaragua, in Asia, in Korea, and Vietnam. And of course, we can't understand the Korean Revolution and the Vietnamese Revolution and revolutions around the world without understanding the role of the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China in their material support for these revolutionary processes. So we need to understand again that multipolarity is what facilitated the rise of socialism in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and the national liberation movements and decolonization movements. And in this sense, I think we have to have a kind of revision. Maybe I shouldn't have said the word revision, because now, I'll be accused of being a revisionist, but maybe a reinterpretation of the orthodox Marxist view in the 19th and early 20th century that revolution would inevitably take place within the imperial core. I think, the majority of great Marxist thinkers going back to Marx and Engels themselves and many of their colleagues and successors in the 19th and early 20th centuries, they got almost everything right. They were correct about most things. But I think one of their fundamental misunderstandings, or one of the things that they simply failed to keep into their calculation, was that the vast majority of revolutions that have happened since then have been in the periphery, not been in the core. And we can talk about why that is, and we can have an entire seminar about why that might be. But after the Russian Revolution, every other significant, socialist revolution and national liberation struggle has been in the periphery or the semi-periphery. You could say Eastern Europe as well, Yugoslavia, but these are not countries deep in the imperial core. The idea that the revolution would take place in the imperial core in Germany and the advanced industrialized capitalist nations, it didn't happen. And there's a lot of reasons we could talk about that, but the reality is that even the Russian Revolution took place in the context of, yes, Tsarist Russia, which was an empire, but it was one of the weakest empires among the European colonialist systems. Lenin himself wrote an article about backward Russia, advanced Asia. So, Russia itself, the Bolshevik movement was very much understood the backwardness of the Russian economy and political system when developing this socialist model. So I think we need to understand that significant historical detail and misunderstanding of early Orthodox Marxists. And that also, I think, really should enrich our understanding of the need for multipolarity for providing space and material support for socialist revolutions and socialist movements. Obviously, with the age of US unipolarity, we saw what the model was imposed economically. Countries in the global South that did achieve national liberation were faced with what Nkrumah called neocolonialism. South Africa is a great example of this. The people of South Africa, with support from the Soviet Union and other countries, they did manage to, in an incredible struggle, achieve legal equality under the law and abolish the apartheid system. But we saw that the ANC economically was forced to make massive concessions. Nelson Mandela was forced to make massive economic concessions and essentially adopt elements of a neoliberal model because they happened to succeed at the moment of US unipolarity. And they did not have the option of having other economic models. That was the Washington Consensus. The IMF and the World Bank imposed that economic model on the world. And economist Michael Hudson has constantly stressed the importance of understanding neoliberalism being a particular form of economic finance capitalism that is related directly to US foreign policy, to US imperialism, forcibly subordinating economies so they can't be food sovereign. So they're forced to export their raw materials to the imperial core so they can't develop a local, productive economy based on actual, a national bourgeoisie. It's all based on this parasitic comprador bourgeoisie. And finally, I want to say, so that with that analysis and that undergirding, why the US is so desperate to prevent the rise of a multipolar world, I mean, we see all around us right now, we see I would say, the opening salvos of this new multipolar order. We see in Los Angeles, California, the disaster of the so-called Summit of the Americas. We see that multiple countries in Latin America, their heads of state, are boycotting the US organized summit, including the presidents of Venezuela, Cuba, Bolivia, Nicaragua, Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. And we also see massive rebellions in the speeches given by leaders inside the summit. We see also that the southern neighbor of the United States, which has a 3,000-kilometer border, Mexico, and the U.S. and Mexico are both each other's most important trading partners. The president of Mexico, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, has been openly criticizing the U.S. policies toward Latin America, openly condemning the U.S.-dominated Organization of American States, calling for enriching the CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, as an alternative, and condemning the U.S. blockade on Cuba, referring to it as a form of genocide. So these are historic developments. We also see that President Nicolás Maduro of Venezuela is right now, today's June 11th, he is in Iran, and he was also just visiting Algeria. And in a speech that he gave in Iran, Maduro talked about the importance of building a multipolar world, of building solidarity between Latin America and other parts of the global south, especially West Asia and North Africa and Algeria and Iran. We also see that Iran has proposed a new currency for trade among the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And I should stress that 40% of the world's population are represented by governments that are states that are members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which represents roughly 1/3 of global GDP. I'm talking about China, Russia, India, Pakistan, Iran just became a member in 2021, and the Central Asian republics. And also Lula da Silva. I'm almost done. Lula da Silva, the former president of Brazil, who is leading all of the polls for the election this October, he has also called for creating a pan-Latin American currency to, quote, end dependency on the dollar, which he calls the Sur, which means South. And we also see that even the Rand Corporation, which is funded by the U.S. military, published a study that was sponsored by the U.S. Air Force that lamentedly concluded that the U.S. can't force its Pacific allies of South Korea, Japan, Thailand, the Philippines, and Australia to install offensive intermediate range ballistic missile systems that the U.S. wants to surround China with. The U.S. military has an Indo-Pacific strategy, and it says it plans on spending more than $20 billion over 5 years, the next 5 years, to install an intermediate range ballistic missile system to threaten China with offensive weapons. These are not defensive. They're strictly offensive weapons. And the U.S. wants to install these missile systems on the first island chain. It only has one small problem. Its allies refuse to accept these missile systems. So all of these signs, I think, are the beginning, the opening seeds of this new multipolar order. That is why the U.S. government is so desperate to prevent the rise of a multipolar world. It understands that, one, in order to maintain its economic hegemony around the world, in order for the U.S. capitalist class to continue imposing neoliberalism around the world and exploiting the natural resources and labor of the global south, it must prevent the rise of multipolarity, especially multipolarity with a socialist pole led by the People's Republic of China. And then finally, we also see that the U.S. strategy in order to prevent this multipolar world is instead in order to try to create a bipolar world. And this is the last thing I'll say. I swear I'm finished here. The U.S. strategy is to, through a new Cold War, to force countries around the world to pick a side in this new bipolar world, as we saw in the first Cold War. We see this with the economic Iron Curtain that the U.S. and the EU have created. They created around Russia, telling countries that they can't do trade with Russia, threatening secondary sanctions on countries that do trade with Russia, and saying essentially, as George Bush said, you're either with us or you're against us. And they are now threatening Taiwan. Joe Biden has made it very clear that the U.S. government is willing to wage a war against the People's Republic of China in order to try to create a secessionist movement inside Taiwan, which is setting the stage for another war and an economic blockade of China, like the economic blockade of Russia, which is essentially creating a bipolar system. That is the US strategy to prevent the rise of a multipolar world. And it's the responsibility, I think, of all anti-imperialists and all socialists to talk about the importance of multipolarity against unipolarity in order to develop these socialist models that we've seen in China, in Cuba, in Venezuela, in Nicaragua, in Vietnam, and Laos, because the US empire's ultimate goal as the leading capitalist power, which is the defender of capitalism, its goal is to prevent the rise of socialism around the world. And that's why it wants to maintain unipolarity to prevent socialism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. We could listen to you for much longer, but we do have to go on to the other speakers. I think your historical clarifications were very, very critical. And in particular, I think you emphasize the centrality of socialism to the evolution of the multipolar world. And I think you've done us a great service. Thank you very much.